Okay, so my question for today really would be, why haven't we made any headway since 2008, and particularly in the UK context? If you watched the news this morning, I reached more depressing initiatives from the coalition. Let's see if we can keep even more foreign students out of the country. That seems to be the latest one by charging them for health. Let's see if we can cut down on the holidays of school children, etc., etc. All part of a general atmosphere of of things tightening in this bitter kind of winter of permanent winter of austerity. Okay, so no surprise then that my answer to the question of why we've made no headway is capitalist realism is the answer. That it's this continuing hold of capitalist realism as a kind of transpersonal ideological field, which has prevented any alternatives from emerging, or which is itself a symptom of the failure of those alternatives to emerge. It's worth reflecting that in 2011, in the exhilaration of the Arab Spring, etc., Paul Mason, the BBC's economics editor, announced this is the end of capitalist realism. Similar claims were made about the student debt protests at the end of 2010. Dan Hancock's, who wrote a book about the student protest, saying, no, this is it, this is the end of capitalist realism. I mean, sadly, it's not proven to be the case. I mean, okay, so for those who don't know, I should say a bit about what I think capitalist realism is. Well, capitalist realism is not the same as neoliberalism, I don't think. And one way that we can get to the differences between the two is that neoliberal ideas, I don't think, are widely accepted, but capitalist realism is. As we saw yesterday, people are still not necessarily persuaded by the key neoliberal commitments. I think most surveys in this country, and John quoted one yesterday, show that people don't accept, for instance, neoliberal models of what education should be. But nevertheless, I think that people are persuaded that there's no real alternative to neoliberal doctrines. And this I think, is what capitalist realism is. Because ideology isn't really about what we ourselves believe. It's what we believe that the other believes. And I think we believe that the other believes that there's no alternative to neoliberalism, as it were. So it's neoliberalism as the kind of inevitable direction of history. That's what is kind of widely accepted. The kind of form of capitalist realism is kind of, we might not like this, but this is how things are. That's why it's realistic. Ostensible, its appeal is to realism. We have to be realistic. So in fact, there's a kind of rejection or distaste for kind of neoliberal doctrines is kind of in some ways built into capitalist realism. In that formulation, we might not like it, but nevertheless, we have to accept it. I mean, what neoliberalism succeeded in doing was really consolidating discrediting of state socialism, really. Which is to say, it captured the discontent with centralized bureaucratic leftism. Now, that discontent, was also originated on the left. It didn't just come from the right. And it established a temporality in which, that model of leftism was out of date and obsolete. Now, part of how it did that was by absorbing and metabolizing the desire for freedom and autonomy that emerged in the wake of the 60s. I think if we're coming up towards a new 68, as Stephen's saying, then it's a bit ambivalent, given that 68 didn't lead to a period of leftist success. It led to a period of, it led eventually to neoliberalism. But the danger with that kind of argument, though, of saying that the 60s led to neoliberalism, is that it's already conceding too much to neoliberalism. It's already conceding what neoliberalism wants to achieve, which is really to bind in those desires in a chain of articulation, with neoliberal policies. and there's no necessary or inevitable connection between the kind of desires that emerged in the 60s and kind of neoliberal capitalism. The success of neoliberalism and really the founding of capitalist realism is based on the idea that there is some necessary and inevitable connection between these two things. So it's important to see neoliberalism partly then in terms of as a symptom of leftist failure, a symptom of the leftist failure to hegemonize, operationalize, instrumentalize, absorb those desires that emerged in the wake of in the 60s. And as Stuart Hall and others involved in a New Times project of the 80s, had warned, and they were totally right in very prescient about this, that the left would inevitably fail if it was unable to respond to those desires, and so it proved. And I mean, part of what's at stake here is the conceding of the concept of modernisation, I think, to neoliberalism, or the making of the two terms equivalent. So, when we hear that, the way that certain, labour disputes are reported, it's often said that, workers are resisting modernisation. And if we're on the side of resisting modernisation, it's fairly hopeless, a kind of Canutism, as my friend Alex Williams calls it. We've spent too long in that, really. But of course, what workers aren't resisting is not resisting modernisation at all. What they're resisting is neoliberalism or neoliberalisation. And that's part of the task, I think, at the moment is to really disarticulate modernisation from neoliberalism. Okay, so what is capitalist realism? On one level, it's the belief that there's no alternative to capitalism, that's one often quotes then the phrase attributed both to James and Zizek that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, etc., etc. But that's in a way a kind of too grand a way of conceiving of what capitalist realism is in terms of most of its impact on our lives, which is evident in a much more banal behaviours and expectations, such as our acceptance that pay will stagnate or get worse, our acceptance that conditions will deteriorate. And it's something, capitalist realism then is something that's pushed by managers when they want us to accept these things. And our acceptance of them is this essentially is what capitalist realism is, I think. A form of acquiescence. So whenever we're presented with a deterioration of conditions, and and the managers tell us, well, exactly this form, we might not like it, I might not like it, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do it, but this is how things are now, and we just have to go along with it. This is what capitalist realism is, I think, in terms of kind of practice. And we can see this with something like REF. Whereas, as a friend of mine said, the perception of something like REF is that it's easy to get rid of slavery than it is to get rid of REF somehow. That kind of attitude is a kind of symptom of capitalist realism too. There's something that's only brought in relatively recently. Now it assumes this kind of force of kind of immortal inevitability. We will never be able to get rid of it somehow. Okay, so to summarise then, I think what I'm saying is capitalist realism then is really an expression of class decomposition, or more simply, the disintegration of class consciousness. And neoliberalism must be seen, I think, fundamentally as a project which aimed at that end. That in other words, it's a political project, not an economic project, fundamentally. So it's not primarily, at least not in practice, dedicated to freeing up the market from state control. And this is something that Werner was arguing yesterday. It's about subordinating the state to the power of capital, which isn't the same thing at all. And, and whatever the problems with David Harvey's account of neoliberalism, I think it's fundamentally correct, and that neoliberalism is then about the reassertion of class power. It's a class project, and that then, therefore, a class war increasingly fought by one side only. The market, like competition, function not as the real ends of neoliberal policy, but as its guiding myths and ideological alibis. So I think we kind of fall into we fall into the neoliberal trap when we argue against something like the market, as if it was interested in the market. It's not interested in the market at all. It is interested in propagating the myth of the market. I mean, capital has no interest in either the health of markets or in competition. And here I think it's worth thinking again about the sort of work of Manuel de Landa, or who draws on Fernand Braudel, with the distinction between markets and anti-markets, and the conception of capitalism as an anti-market. I think whatever you think of markets is at least strategically a useful distinction to make, because we can see that the kind of founding myth of neoliberalism is the pseudo-opposition between the state and capital. But what if we posit a distinction between capital and markets? I think that's lots of interesting consequences can follow from that. One consequence of the neoliberal positing of the state versus state markets opposition was get small businesses on side. They think, we don't like the state interfering in our business. Part of the success of neoliberalism, false class consciousness, is in people identifying with big corporations as if they were them somehow. Whereas if we posit an opposition between markets and capital, there's the potential to disaggregate this alliance between small business and big business. But I mean, it's pretty obvious that there isn't really a tendency towards greater competition, etc. in capitalism. When you look around at what actually existing capitalism is like, the tendency is actually towards formation of oligopolies, monopolies, etc. We only have to look at something in our everyday life that we sort of take for granted. It's Microsoft Word. Everyone hates it. We all have to use it. How is that? But I mean, how is that a product of a competitive kind of economy? It's not at all. We saw yesterday Mark Levine's research. We were looking ideology straight in the face here about the radical distinction between the claims made on behalf of the claims made on behalf of the privatization of the university, that it inspires entrepreneurialism, that produces growth, etc. We saw yesterday in bold figures that the total falsity of that. So what is really going on then? In terms of education, then, David Blacker's forthcoming book, The Falling Rate of Learning and the Neoliberal Endgame, has a really strong account. Just going to read you a lengthy quote from this, which is very pithy, I think. It's a misunderstanding, Blacker argues, to say that what we are witnessing is a withdrawal or retreat of the state from the public sphere. There is indeed a push towards privatisation and Orwellian named public-private partnerships in schools and elsewhere, especially in universities. But as in the case of voucher and many charter schemes, these are still funded by public money, and as such they are better understood as reallocations of public resources, such that they are available for private capture by elites. On a larger scale, the processes before us might be described as a systemic hybridization of state and private sectors, where ironically the state attempts to protect elites from the vagaries of the marketplace through massive bank bailouts, loan guarantees, etc. Regarding the latter, even the oft-used phrase casino capitalism is misleading. In our current situation of socialised risk and privatised gain, for those at the system's commanding heights, it is tails they win and heads we lose. Imagine a casino in which when you play with the house money, and if you win, you get to keep all the winnings to yourself, whereas if you lose, the house covers your bets. The literally astronomical public sums required to continue this arrangement for the minutest percentage of the population is the proximal cause of the squeeze on public resources. School children, the poor, the sick, the disabled, the elderly must all sacrifice so elites no longer have to undergo the risks that are officially supposed to be inherent in their role as fearless capitalist risk takers. But the zombie lives on in the cherished ideology of competition, whose virtues are conveniently to be reserved only for the masses. Competition and risk is for small businesses and other little people like private and public sector employees. So again, I don't think we should buy into the idea that the aim of neoliberalism is that the end of neoliberalism is competition, the introduction of competition, or so-called marketization. Rather, these are weapons to achieve their actual goal, which is the destruction of solidarity. So, for instance, if we turn again to education, the example of education, the competition education, both amongst institutions and amongst individuals, is not something that spontaneously emerges once state regulation is removed. I mean, we can see this very clearly by the kind of mechanisms that are imposed on us. On the contrary, it is something that actively produced by bureaucratic means. The REF is again an example of this. This only looks like a paradox if we take neoliberalism at its word. If neoliberalism really is about, reducing bureaucracy, reducing the role of the state, etc. But if we look at neoliberalism for what it actually is, rather than what it says it is, then it's not a paradox at all. Jeremy Gilbert has written on this, drawing on Foucault's work on neoliberalism, pointing out that the difference between classic liberalism and neoliberalism is that exactly what Werner was saying yesterday. Neoliberalism is not laissez-faire. Neoliberalism doesn't trust people. Neoliberalism, maintains that people, must be subjugated, must be subjected to kind of endless, ceaseless behavioural regimes, or they might be, or their collectivity might emerge actually. These behaviours, such as competition, etc., have to be positively engendered, and that's certainly what we see in relation to the university. And then I think then this means that we can see that the anxiety produced by something like REF and other managerialist mechanisms, the kind of self-surveillance, continual professional development, etc., which even the most menial kind of work now comes attached to. It's not some accidental side effect of these systems, it's their real aim. Again, we shouldn't think that they're failing, that these things are supposed to be about improving efficiency or improving our performance as workers. What they actually do is just make us anxious and overworked. No, they want to make it, the aim is to make us anxious, overworked, etc. That's what they're fully succeeding in that. Okay, and just to conclude then, I think I've got a couple of minutes left. So what do we need to do in the face of this? Well, first of all, I think we need to reject strategies that don't work, and I think that one of the chief problems is kind of horizontalism and what I call neo-anarchism. Neo-anarchism is the kind of shadow of neoliberalism in lots of ways. This faith in horizontalism that I think confuses goals with means with ends, really. We want to end up with a society without hierarchy, but that doesn't mean we can just abolish hierarchy now by fiat in our own organisational practice. There's, and I think we can talk longer about this in the discussion if there's time, but the further corollaries of the emphasis on horizontalism in neo-anarchism are an attack on the idea of what they call mainstream media, MSM, and of Parliament. It's kind of the mirror of the neoliberal attack on the state. As it were, the right don't really believe this. The right don't believe that the neoliberal right might profess their hatred for the state while occupying the state and instrumentalising the state. It's only the left. Okay. it's but it. Yeah, the right have the anti-state rhetoric, but they have the practice of devoting lots of resources to ensure that they control the state. They may not like them, but they're not idiots. Why do they do that if the state is completely irrelevant now? So I think we need a return to so-called mainstream media and Parliament. I mean, because these things are not fixed essences; they're terrains. And a lot of what is it that makes the other believe X, Y, or Z? It's because what constitutes a reality for us is partly determined by the mainstream media and by parliaments. It's not that these that in themselves will solve all the problems, but it should be clear now that unless we make headway in those areas, that we can't possibly succeed. There's a kind of anarchist fatalism, which is the kind of shadow of capitalist realism, and that takes the form of, it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism than a left-wing Labour Party. Now, it might not be that imaginable in the current circumstances that we have a left-wing Labour Party, but you have to compare that fatalism to the kind of optimism and ambition of neoliberals. Neoliberals, look at the state that the Labour Party was in, look at the commitments the Labour Party had when neoliberals decided they would take it over. The commitment to Clause 4, nationalisation, all the rest of it. Instead of thinking, that's going to be like that forever, they thought, right now we'll have that, we'll convert it to our way of thinking. Why can't we do that? I'm coming to an end, yeah. Why can't we do that? Why can't we have that same ambition? That involves, I think, you're not going to be able to do it tomorrow. You can't just join the Labour Party and but tomorrow will be converted to a kind of new way of thinking. You have to think in at least probably a decade ahead. But I think that's also key to kind of strategic thinking anyway. And it's not just as if the Labour Party itself will deliver anything. It's just an example, really. Second thing, we're training ourselves to a war mentality. There's no point, we are in a class war, we've lost it, we're losing it. Stop thinking as if we're not. I mean, Jodie's work is very good on this, on openness, etc. Openness, might be some ethical virtue. It's not a very good military virtue. And that's connected with, I think, Claire was talking about secrecy today. Secrecy is good if you're fighting a war. You don't want to let your enemy know everything you're doing. Partly this is, we have to retrain ourselves from the psychological legacy of post-structuralism, etc., and really distinguish political virtues from aesthetic virtues. And I think part of the issues of what I'm shorthand purposes calling post-structuralism, is to confuse the two. Like negative capability, it's good for poetry, but it's not that good for political war. Like being in a state of, doubts, skepticisms, uncertainty, etc. If you think of yourself as being in a war situation, if you think of your enemy as being in those states of mind, you think it's pretty good for you. It's pretty good. Sure, the right is laughing all the way to the bailed out banks about that, really. And then the final point then is, I think, rethinking what is at stake in concepts like solidarity and desire in terms of plasticity. I think Jodie quoted yesterday from Freud the idea that drives are extraordinarily plastic, and this should be something that's encouraging. Catherine Malaby's done some interesting work on plasticity. But plasticity is not the same as flexibility, as she argues. And one of the ways in which plasticity differs from flexibility is it's not elasticity. Elasticity is where a form returns to exactly the same shape it had in a prior time, whereas the plastic retains some memory. And this is partly what we need as an institutional, on the left, is some kind of institutional memory. I mean, this kind of argument that it's okay, Occupy failed, but it will, might lead to further success. Well, it might do, but it won't automatically, unless there was some system for transmitting the lessons of the past. solidarity, just the final thing now. Solidarity does not entail unity. I think that's the important thing we need to get over. Instead of unity, coordination. Think in terms of coordination. The right have been better postmodernists than us. They are able to organise coalitions of heterogeneous interest groups. We've struggled with that. Final thing then, desire is not a fixed biological essence, but something capable of infinite recomposition. Advertisers, branders know that. We also have to learn it, and we have to compete with them. Okay, that's it.